which is Epiphany, is the time span that stretches from right after Christmas all the way up until Ash Wednesday, may remember that I asked you each week to keep watch for God at work. And then every week when we gathered for worship, I invited you to find a partner and to share how you had seen God at work during the week. I didn't always get to partner up with someone, but recently I was told that what this seemingly simple action, looking for God and sharing that sighting with one another, was actually quite a struggle for most of us who gathered for worship. Many weeks seemed to pass by in a blur of work and frenzy and driving and family commitments, and before we knew it, we had forgotten to watch for God. Or nothing had taken place that week that seemed like it could be the work of God. And so many weeks, I think many of us turned to one another and shrugged our shoulders and said, I don't know how God was at work this week. What I think we discovered during the season of Epiphany, and what I think we still probably discover each and every week, is that it is easy to perceive God at work in those good parts of life. It's easy to thank God for a sunny day after a long winter. It's easy to hear God in the newborn cries of a child and rejoice at new life. It's easy to celebrate another year of life like we did a couple years ago when John Denkinger celebrated another birthday. But it is downright difficult to proclaim that you have met God in the everyday struggle and muck of life, especially when there is suffering involved in your life and in the lives of those around you. It's difficult to hear God in the cries of your sister who has lupus and will never be cured. It's difficult to hear God in the depression of your father who may have lost his job. It's difficult to hear God in the exhaustion you feel at the end of another week, or in the despair of your neighbor who can never seem to get off food stamps and is chronically on the verge of homelessness, or in the anger, especially of a drug dealer locked up in prison, or in the needs of a man sitting on the street corner. We like to connect God with good things, with nice things, with hopeful things that make us feel good. But this week, in our last parable that we hear Jesus tell before he enters into his week of passion, Jesus turns that association upside down. And he tells a parable to the disciples that confronts our easy faith in God of only good things and calls us to look deeper and to carry our faith out into the real world in which we live and to step into real lives that are not pretty, and then to meet God who is already there. Jesus begins today's parable with a vision of the end of time, when he will come again in all his glory and be seated on the throne. And then he will separate out those sheep from the goats. This is an image of God we're familiar with. We even have a picture of Jesus carrying around some nice sheep over here in the front of the sanctuary that we see every day in worship. It's a God with great power. God on a throne, God declaring eternal life. So far, this parable seems okay. But soon as we move deeper into this riddle, Jesus slips out of his throne and disappears amongst the throngs of braying sheep and goats. Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom of God prepared for you, he says to the sheep. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger. I was naked. I was sick. I was in prison, and you visited me. the sheep's only response to such words is confusion. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food? We don't remember doing such thing. When were you naked and we gave you clothes? When were you a stranger and we welcomed you? Their confusion is again echoed a little bit later by the goats when their life is called into account the same way that the sheep's life is called into account. Neither the sheep nor the goats in this parable understand what Jesus is telling them. There is no difference in their response. Neither one of them have seen their lives as Jesus has seen them. Neither group had recognized Jesus either when he had walked into their lives, because frankly, he didn't appear to them as they had expected it. A couple weeks ago, I decided that I needed a new pair of dress shoes, as I often can tend to do, so I headed into the city to go to my favorite shoe store. I had researched and found the shoes that I wanted, and so I went in and tried on the shoes, and they fit just right. And then I saw another pair sitting there on the ledge, and I thought, oh, I'll try those on too. They're on sale, it'll be okay. And I walked out of the shoe store that afternoon with 2 new pairs of shoes hanging from my shoulder. I was walking down the street, making my way back to the train and thinking about these new shoes in my bag when I heard a voice coming from the sidewalk beside me. I had seen the man sitting there with a cardboard sign in front of him, but I wasn't going to pay him much mind when I heard this very small voice come out from him. Will anyone help me? I could barely even hear it, but as I got closer, I could hear him say again, will anyone help me? And my feet stopped. And I started to listen to this man who usually I would ignore as he said, will anyone help me? I turned and I said, will a granola bar be okay? Yes, he responded. So I reached into my overly large purse that was slung on the other shoulder and found the granola bar that had been hiding in there for weeks and put it into his hands. Truthfully, though, I didn't give him the granola bar because I truly wanted to help him. It will only assuage his hunger for a little bit after all. I gave him a granola bar that afternoon because of the guilt that I felt hanging from my other shoulder, from those 2 pairs of new shoes that hung in a bag from my shoulder while a man sat on the sidewalk and begged for help. I didn't give him a granola bar out of compassion. I gave it because I wanted to even out my karma, to assuage my guilt. I didn't necessarily feel a whole lot of compassion for him, or even because I recognized God in the eyes of this man sitting on a patch of concrete. It is a challenge to our faith to meet God in the deepest suffering and despair that we encounter in our lives. We want to worship a God on a throne, not a God who sits on the sidewalk and asks for help. We want a God who will make everything all right, and a God who keeps us comfortable. But in our last parable that we heard today, our last parable of Lent, that Jesus tells just 2 days before he is arrested, Jesus refuses to be that God. For God came into the world not to comfort the comfortable, not to proclaim a purely spiritual message that warms our hearts, or even to be the one who assuages our guilt when we act selfishly. Nope. God was born into the fragile human flesh of a poor girl who couldn't even afford to go to the hospital, to suffer the never-ending pain that seems like it's engulfing this world. God was born into this world to sit on the sidewalks and ask for us to help. God was born into this world to sit at soup kitchens with those who are hungry and with those who are lonely. God was born into this world to cry out in pain with those who are sick and will never get well again. God came into our world and feels the shame of those who are naked and exposed, to be with those who are condemned and tormented and locked up in overcrowded prisons with no hope for a better life. And God comes and sits on street corners and asks for compassion and for someone to stop and to see him. Back in Epiphany, we tried to look for God. But I think we have learned during the season of Lent, and especially in this parable today, that if you want to encounter Jesus, if you are looking for God at work in this world, he is already here, in the dimly lit places of our lives, in the lives of those who suffer and struggle and kick and scream back at life, and in those who bear the pain of this world. Soon Jesus will be handed over to be crucified. He will eat one last meal and then go hungry. He will be arrested and put into prison where no one will visit him. He will be stripped of his clothing and mocked, and he will become a stranger to everyone as he is deserted by his friends. He will be thirsty and ask for something to drink, and then he will die alone, hungry, naked, thirsty, and condemned, along with so many of our brothers and sisters who are still suffering today. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food? When was it that we saw you thirsty and gave you water? When was it that we saw you a stranger, or when you were sick, or when you imprisoned? We will see him on the cross, a cross that still stands today in the suffering of each and every one of your lives, a cross that stands in the struggles of your neighbors, a cross that stands in the pain of the children around the world. We began our Lenten journey with Jesus telling us, if any of you want to be my disciples, take up your cross and follow me. Today, Jesus has slipped from his throne of power and is headed to the cross. That has been his destination all along, and to be his disciple is to follow him there and to every cross that he's still hanging on today. If you want to know Jesus, if you want to see God at work in the world, look to the cross. It is standing on our street corners. It is standing in soup kitchens. It is locked behind closed doors of secrets and in the lines that snake through welfare offices. It is standing with those 7 children who died in a house fire in Brooklyn this weekend. And it flows in every painful tear and in every scream of exhaustion that comes out from God's children. For God is already come into the pain of this world. The question is, though, can you love the one who comes to you on the cross as much as you might love the one who sits up